Hues of the Horizon, Chapter 2. Kano woke up, not knowing who or where he was. Despite feeling like he just came out from a long dream, it felt like he hasn't slept in days. His eyelids slowly dropped, blocking out the bright sun he faced. He relaxed his muscles and fell on his bare back, a crate landing on top of him, its contents pouring out. He didn't realize he was standing with a crate in his arms, but he didn't care. He lay on the dirt, a warm heat enveloping him. Sleep began to come over him when another need entered his mind. He was thirsty. His eyes opened and he sat up slowly. As he glanced around at his surroundings, his fatigue was pushed to the back of his mind. 3 men on the ground, badly sunburnt, lay peacefully next to him. They wore no clothing besides a loincloth and had smooth wooden necklaces around their necks. None of them were breathing. Kano became aware of his own lack of clothing. A similar leather loincloth and wooden pendant were the only attire shielding him from the sun. Strangely, he wasn't that hot. He set the crate down to his side, stood up and turned away from the bodies. Looking at his environment, a large expanse of tan dirt stretched as far as he could see, the occasional green plant dotting the plain like specks of paint. He shouldn't be here. He didn't know why. He stood there, staring at the wilderness that surrounded him. It was so barren and featureless that it inspired an ironic sense of grandeur. He looked for any sign of a lake or other source of water, but found none. He had woken up to a death sentence. There was nowhere to go, nothing to drink. Kano slowly sat down, resigning himself to his fate. An object uncomfortably protruded off the ground where he sat. Leaning forward, he grabbed it and pulled it up to his face. A wooden necklace like the one that the other men wore. However, this one had a detailed pattern on it. A mark. It was familiar to him somehow. Memories emerged suddenly, like a canvas being filled by a flood of paint. They were all blurry and confusing without meaning. Vague shapes moved through his mind, and undefined sounds like crackling fire filled his thoughts. It was too much. Kano closed his eyes tight, trying to clear his head, but it was no use. Vibrant imagery of his entire lifetime hid from him in a painful display of art, and it didn't stop. Suddenly, a memory solidified. The maelstrom of images faded as a scene presented itself in full. He sat on a coarse bed in a cramped room. The walls were made of unrefined wood and were stained with dark splotches. A variety of browns was contrasted only by a small white canvas unmarked. Kano's eyes held unmoving from the canvas. It called to him, wanting to be given life. It wanted to be the sun, or a castle, or a prison. But none of them were original enough for Kano. He'd drawn them all before. The sun was the only thing he drew for months, back when it was novel. After the sun became boring, he kept finding new unique things to draw until everything became ordinary. A knock on the door took his troubled thoughts away from him. Before he could answer, a tall, middle-aged woman entered the room. Her straight, brown hair fell down to a modest, dark brown dress, and her face held a knowing smile. She spoke with a slight Ilkyrian accent and a voice as sweet as a plum fruit. "I assume you have been successful in obtaining work, given that you seem rather relaxed. Does that mean you will finally be paying for your room?" Kano stood up, his right hand nervously gripping the hem of his shirt. "Madame Runa, I was just taking a break, I promise." Kano forced a smile to his face. "Work is rather difficult to find for someone like me. I'm picky, too. I don't want lousy work for the rest of my life when that's all I've been doing lately." Madame Runa sighed. "Kano, no job will make you happy. You should use your skills you have, even if you don't like them." She hesitated, looking down. "I know that it reminds you of the past, but you should apply for servanthood with the Opal priests. They'll treat you better than your old masters." The edges of her lips curled in a slight grin. And I heard you get to paint. Uh, I'll think about it. Kano lied. There was no way he would become anything close to a servant again. Runa nodded and closed the door. Kano picked up his brush and began painting in the only colors he had, a dull red and a dirty yellow. He discarded his frustration and anger, putting them into the paint. Long strokes of yellow mixed with dashes of red formed a dreadful brown which fell down to the bottom of the canvas like a waterfall, overlapping a sea of red at the bottom of the canvas. Kano painted red lips, yellow eyes, and light brown hair. He sat down on his bed to admire his work. A solemn portrait of Runa was captured in time within the canvas. It betrayed reality, the limited colors creating a dark mood. A whirlwind of red anger swarmed around Runa, but her face was serene. She had always seemed calm, even when the world was against her. Kano placed his brush and paint on the table next to his bed. His obligation to Runa forced him out the door. The landlady passed him on his way out of the building, a cheerful smile encouraging him. Kano hoped that she liked his painting. She always did. Before entering into the city, the memory began to fade away, the vivid colors melting and mixing to a surreal display of color. Soon the colors slowed and solidified. A new scene formed around him. Kano stood in a bright room made of marble. A pattern was presented in front of him on a stone tablet. 3 vertical lines, 2 horizontal lines, and a circle, each bent and curved to become irregular. A confident voice, originating from behind him, began to speak, startling him. "What do you know of this mark, painter?" Kano stood erect and unmoving, as if he were made of stone. He responded matter-of-factly. "It is the mark that is commonly used by explorers and hunters to survive in the desert. The lines represent fire, and the circle represents protection." He had obviously rehearsed his response. However, it had not appeased the voice. "You claim to want to learn how to use marks for the palace, and yet you neglect to mention anything important. Nothing about the actual effect, nothing on the length of time it lasts." Kano blinked in surprise. Despite his preparations, he'd focused too much on the artistry of marks and not their function. He opened his mouth, writing another response, but the voice came first. "However, your answer is acceptable. Come back at moonset tomorrow. You will begin training with one of my priests. Afterwards, you will receive the mark of acceptance." Kano paused, his mouth still open. He didn't expect to be accepted. "You know more than most people who come to us. Given a few weeks, you will be a useful servant." Servant. He was returning to his old life. A life of commands and punishments. But he swallowed his pride. He turned and bowed to the figure behind him. "I will be there, my lord." The brown-skinned man who sat on the marble throne smiled. Regal clothes, worn by priests, adorned his thin body. "You are excused." "Thank you, my lord." Kano raised his head and walked out of the room, careful not to look at the priest directly. Once he was out of sight, the stiffness of his posture softened, and emotion began to grow in him. Delight with his acceptance, dread of his return to servanthood, frustration at his lack of options. He sat on a stone bench in the hallway and closed his eyes, trying to push back his emotions. As a tear fell down his cheek, the walls ran like a river, reconstructing into another memory. The ceiling rose high, and the colors of the stone began to morph. Instead of a hallway, he stood in a grand chamber, with colorful glass depicting religious scenes complementing the smooth white walls. A colorful sea of people danced before him, a rapid drum beat, shaking their bodies like puppets on strings. A high priest to Kano's left bellowed a soothing song, somehow complementing the beat, despite the contrast. Kano stood in front of a stone table with a variety of marks painted with a rainbow of coloring. His previous emotional fragility was gone. He calmly pressed down on a crimson mark and imagined flame bursting into the air, pockets of explosion mimicking the beat. Then he willed it to be true. The mark glowed, and a plume of fire shot out of it, curling like a wild serpent. The crowd cried out with glee. and shouted short exclamations at each burst of the beat. The mark faded, as did the fire it created. Kano pressed down on another mark. After seeing the image in his mind, the mark glowed a deep brown. The stone beneath the priest rose, a column of earth elevating halfway to the roof. The drum beat faster, the crowd dancing more desperately. The priest's song came to a finish, a satisfied smile resting on his face. 5 sharp beats concluded the dance. The glistening skin of the multitude shone nearly as bright as the stone that they stood on. The priest overhead quieted the crowd, then nodded at Kano. He activated another mark, which shared a similar symbol to the previous one. The stone behind him melted, turning into a clear pool of water that barely was bigger than a person. As he did this, the priest spoke to a group. The crowd, giving a rehearsed monologue about the purity of water. Water dissolves in the desert and freezes in the tundra, but here, in the belt, the water is pure. It is the blood of the planet. Let the water cleanse us from our impurities, removing our natural instincts of vice and violence, just as the Opal One did when he first came from the stars. But even water can have impurities. That is why the Opal One granted us with marks. Only through his gifts can we remove the unholiness that we have inherited from our ancestors. Thirst crept into Kano's consciousness. Water. There was water. He needed to drink. Lucidity ripped through him, his actions and the memory and his thoughts separated. The mark he had just used created water. If he could remember it, replicate it, he could create water. In his memory, his past self stared at the priest, taking occasional glances at the stone table to ensure that he was ready to activate the next mark. During those glances, he did his best to memorize the various marks he saw. The oration concluded, and Kano lowered the priest back to the floor. The congregation were welcomed forward, and they all reverently stepped into a line next to the pool of water. Kano was uninterested in the rite, but despite his best efforts, he couldn't remove himself from the dreamlike memory. One by one, the people silently stepped into the water and plunged their entire body underwater. Moments later, they had emerged, smiling. Most pulled themselves out and moved to the wall to watch the others immerse themselves. A few times, however, the person would exclaim to the assembly that they had a blessed experience. Questions that they had were answered, or they felt the Opal One purify them. At each of these announcements, the line became more restless. The ceremony lasted for a grueling hour. The majority of the crowd talked amongst themselves, paying Kano little attention. The high priest gave another speech, nearly a duplicate of his initial sermon. Kano pressed down on another mark, and the water shifted back to its original stone form, leaving the area with the indent of waves. After the speech, the congregation swarmed to the door, and the hall was silent. The priest ordered Kano to reorganize and began walking towards the back of the chamber, towards his personal room. Kano retrieved a broom from a nearby closet and swept the conglomeration of fabric, feathers, and other miscellaneous items that had fallen during the ceremony. A misshapen pile quickly formed in the corner of the room as he completed his duty. Kano stepped up to the high priest's door and knocked. The door opened for a short moment, revealing the high priest with a small letter in hand. "Take this letter to the Supreme One personally. It is of great importance." Kano's heart skipped a beat. The Supreme One, sir? Surely one of my position cannot meet with him. Show his attendants my seal, and they will let you visit with him. The priest paused for a second. And do not, under any circumstance, view the contents of the letter, or allow another to view it. Understand? Yes, my lord. The priest gave the letter to Kano, who received it carefully. The glistening mark could be seen through the thick paper. Kano could not identify its effects, but it contained the symbol for fire. It was likely a fail-safe. "I expect you to be back before moonrise." Kano bowed and retreated towards the entrance. The Opal Palace loomed tall in front of Kano. The gem at its peak of the center shone brilliantly as the light from the sun grazed it. Smooth marble towers rose parallel to the central tower. Without sunlight reflecting off of them, the stone was a drab gray, conjuring a solemn mood to the surrounding grounds. To Kano, the glorious palace looked instead like a terrifying prison. It still inspired awe in him. He stepped to the gate, where 2 glassy-eyed guards stood. He He slowed to a stop a respectable distance away, and they both advanced in sync. Before they could say a word, Kano presented them the letter, the crimson seal of the high priest adorning the front of the envelope. They glanced at each other, then stepped aside. Once Kano had traveled through the large entrance, a young boy took his coat, and a thin old man stood at attention. "I'm here to deliver a letter to the Supreme One. Can you take him to me?" The old servant stepped forward. "I'm sorry, but it is customary for the servants of the Supreme One to deliver him his mail." With the same motion he had done minutes before, Kano revealed the seal. "My master required me to bring the letter to the Supreme One personally." Upon seeing the letter, the man bowed. "Of course, sir. Come right this way." Kano felt uneasy about being called sir. It was often something he told his own superiors. It felt wrong to be called sir himself. As the old man gestured him towards the grand staircase, his uneasiness shifted sources. The Supreme One was the most powerful man in the Opal Kingdom, and he was going to meet him. As they stepped through the palace, a room caught his eye. Masterful paintings of priests healing wounds and helping the poor filled an entire room. He had seen powerful depictions such as this at the High Priest's Cathedral, but none were so well crafted. He slowed and stepped into the room, forgetting the task he was here for. The old servant hobbled after him, but failed to pull Kano from his distraction. Kano studied each painting thoroughly for the various techniques and styles of the artists. Simple blots of iridescent paint became forests. Thin lines formed buildings. The eyes of beggars showed their pain. Shining marks looked otherworldly and magical, rays of light casting shadows on the priests and peasants. It was realistic but stylized. Kano could empathize with the characters. He could feel the power of the marks. "Excuse me, sir, but you were here to deliver something, are you not?" Kano tore his eyes away from the painting, panic and embarrassment rising within him. I'm sorry, I just got distracted. I'll be more careful." The old man nodded and continued down the hall with Kano sauntering behind him. Finally, at the highest part of the central tower, Kano stood in front of a large black door. The old man scurried away, obviously annoyed at Kano's constant distractions. Kano stood there for a couple minutes, stress slowly building in his chest. He closed his eyes, trying to calm down his nerves. All he had to do was knock on the door, hand over the letter, tell him it's important, then return the way he came. Kano knocked on the door. A minute passed. No one answered the door. He knocked again. More stress appeared. His simple plan was quickly becoming more complicated. He reached for the door handle and hesitated. How bad would it be to go into the Supreme One's room? His mission was one from a high priest, and it was important, and no one told him he couldn't enter. He had to deliver the letter, right? With a deep sigh and a heavy breath, Kano pushed the heavy door open. The room was shadowy, and a soft conversation could be heard from a wooden door to his right. Despite his expectations, the Supreme One's room was quite humble, considering his position. Colorful feathers were strewn across the floor, obviously originating from a modest bed with a single pillow in the corner, which had a thin layer of feathers decorating the ground around it. The only other piece of furniture in the room was a squat desk with a stack of letters between two large windows, which faced away from the sun. A candle on the desk, the only light source in the room, illuminated the various letters. Kano stepped to the desk and glanced at the various letters. Some were addressed to various high priests and officials from other countries. Most, however, were in languages Kano had never seen before. He considered whether or not he should place the letter in the stack and leave it so he didn't need to confront the Supreme One. However, if he did that, he couldn't confirm the Supreme One received the message, and the letter was important according to High Priest. Muffled dialogue continued from the doorway. The Supreme One was likely on the other side. Kano could just quickly deliver the letter to him and leave. He had already entered his room. He couldn't do much worse. Kano rehearsed a short speech about the importance of the letter, took a deep breath to calm his nerves, and pushed through the door. An abyss stood before him. A torrent of light and darkness spun like a whirlpool, shifting hues and shades sporadically. An eternity of color, a fragment of the universe. Incomprehensible pandemonium. An agonizing pain entered Kano's entire being. He didn't understand what was happening. A single figure stood in the center of the maelstrom, the only thing that held any solid form. A cacophony of unintelligible sounds pierced Kano's psyche. He couldn't think, he couldn't feel. The figure turned slowly. His eyes were a bright orange, as if they held a burning flame. Words came from his mouth, but they didn't have any meaning. Kano began to shake uncontrollably. His knees buckled. He fell to the floor, staring into the abyss as his body convulsed, and the abyss stared back.